Hi, I'm Matt, and welcome to Just in Time, the rapid fire roundup of current events in supply chain and beyond. With me again are members of the Anvyl team. From our global operations team, we got Dan. How you doing, Dan?
Doing well. How you doing?
Doing great. And we got Will. How you doing?
It's cracking, Matt.
Cool. All right, let's dig in. Last week, Consumer Advisory covered the class of startups that have raised about $70 billion to buy up successful Amazon sellers and build a portfolio of brands. So-called e-commerce aggregators like Thrasio have seen great success with this formula. How could they be even more successful? I'm going to punt this over to you, Will.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that they can continue to do and maybe think about start doing. In the article, they talk about, consolidating some of the items from a supply chain perspective. And I think the economies of scale is something that's easy and that you have certain suppliers that do well, and maybe new suppliers or existing suppliers that aren't doing well. Where can you move certain volume to take some of that lack of performance out of the picture and say, okay, I'm going to put this at a new supplier. I think some of the things that they can also start to do is that they can geographically look about where they should be. They talk about how China is such a big influence in terms of where some of these things are being produced. I think we know that there are other locations that are just as capable as doing it, depending on what they're actually producing. So I would think that there's a big opportunity for someone to look at, okay, I'm making a specific thing. Does it have to be in China? Can it be here? And you get the logistics saving, you get the freight, you get some of the speed that comes into play. And we know ultimately those things are really tacking on cost and hurting margins.
Yeah, I think the most immediate thing they've mentioned is on the marketing side, where Purge mentioned that 50% savings on margin. So they definitely have better capability of buying ads when they're summed up. Overall, I mean, they're on Amazon, so it's going to be fulfillment by Amazon, but they can easily set up their own distribution, fulfillment centers, as you mentioned, warehousing as well, and build from there and more control the last mile instead of Amazon controlling the last mile. So for them, they can probably get better margins leaving some of the Amazon ecosystem, but that's also great unknown is how will these products perform when they live outside of Amazon, because that's where they were established on. So how well will they do in the other D2C markets, or are they going to establish like their own storefronts where they have everything, like the beta stores that were in New York City that just had a hodgepodge of different consumer products that were in there. So it'll be interesting to see like where they go from here and how well they do when they leave the Amazon marketplace.
Yeah, I think the one thing that Perch mentioned when they were saying they were going to set up 2 to 4 of their own locations is that, like, is that in their core competency? Like, how long does it take them to get that set up? Is it something that truly they see, pricing reduction on versus doing it from Amazon? Does it end up being, more of a time suck than they thought it was going to be? I think a lot of times people say, like, yeah, sure, we could do it, but it may be outside their realm. And by the time they do it, they're like, should we have done this?
Good stuff, guys. Thanks. All right, moving along. Retail Dive highlighted the ongoing shipping bottleneck, which is already impacting broader plans for the holiday season. While major retailers and brands may be able to buy their way out of this situation, what are some of the strategies that smaller and startup brands should consider? Dan, I'll ask you.
Yeah, I mean, we're calling mid-August right now. You're in full, if you're not in holiday mode right now, you better get into holiday mode, especially for secondary packaging when it comes to like your ship boxes. Normally you see lead times 4 to 6 weeks on those items because you're going to probably establish new artwork, and you need to do your approval process on print proofs and look at that copy. But just because of all the bottlenecks that have occurred from shipping and just global shortages across the board, even like local manufacturers, their lead times have increased. So get ahead of the game. Maybe make your ship boxes if you can corrugated. Make them stateside. Don't import them. You'll save plenty of time there. If you haven't placed your orders for holidays, I would, for your primary vessels and you have your forecasts, I'd probably do that this week if you can, just because we know how congested ports are. I mean, it's alleviated a little bit. I mean, there was some shutdowns in China last month. Labor is starting to pick up a little bit on the US side. So goods are getting unloaded a lot faster. But still the biggest unknown is the Delta variant that is amongst us. And how is that going to impact more of the ports or just worker shortages in general, if it's on the trucking side or rail side, which are still seeing delays. So there's still a lot of unknown. And if you have the means to get your purchase orders in now, or if you've already done so, like, you're set up more for success. If you're waiting for the last minute, especially with the unknowns that we have so far this year, you're probably going to miss that holiday deadline, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think what people are seeing is that, what type of products are they making? So if it is a high margin item that you have to get in, but the cost is making sense. There's a lot of people that are just go ahead and building in air freight for some of the items, knowing that they need to hit certain minimum orders to get things going and that they can backfill it as things come in on a boat. For those items that are not as margin friendly and they're taking a hit more on the shipping side, I think they're having a harder look at where they're making it or how they can go about doing something a little bit different. We know people are getting squeezed on raw materials. We know people are getting squeezed on any labor shortage where it's a surcharge or things getting pushed to the back because their processes are more manual. So if you do fall into those categories as a startup brand or a small business, what can you control? Putting orders in for longer periods of time to give the suppliers you work with some flexibility to get things on order. Really those are the couple things you can do outside of being at the mercy of whoever your logistics carrier is.
Thanks, guys. All right, finally, Supply Chain Quarterly suggests that your supply chain can actually be a source of growth when it's more customer-centric. I'm going to go off script here and just read from the article. Customer-centric supply chain is defined as being tailored, agile, trustworthy, innovative. I encourage you to read the article if you want to find out a little bit more about what those mean. But to you guys, I'll pass it back. What do you think of how they've defined a customer-centric supply chain? What is that? What's your interpretation? Pretty well.
Yeah, I think that the thing that I see is they want it your last mile. You want as fast as you can deliver it. And there's a lot of costs associated with setting that up. And so, from a brand perspective, are you big enough? Are you well established enough to, command some of those things they're talking about? I think there are certain things a brand can do to, get there on maybe 1 to 2 of those items, whether it be, your big demographic, you're within 2 days shipping of 80% of the people who buy your product, or, you can differentiate some of your offerings based on who's ordering because you have a pretty flexible third-party logistics. I think it's a big challenge for someone that's not well established to do all 4. But, there's a couple of different things that you can do, to make sure you're at least covering one of those boxes. But in the end, people need to want your product as well. Like it could be all of those things, but if they don't want your product, it doesn't matter. So I still think you need to focus on having the right product that people want. And then, doing 1 to 2 of those 4, I think you're still in a pretty good place.
Yeah, I agree with what Will was saying there. Look, Amazon drove up those expectations of packages initially within 1 to 2 days through Prime, but what the consumer also doesn't care about is like Amazon suffered a loss from fulfilling those. But I mean, that's not on the consumer to care. That all that does is changes the consumer's expectations. But with that, now has become that new model of same day with those micro fulfillment centers that are geographically positioned to assist, as Will said, and cut down on the zones that you're delivering to. But factoring into that, like there's going to be a cost associated with that. What's the weight of your product? Like last mile, are you setting up your own delivery services? Or are you still going to be reliant on the traditional players like the USPS, FedEx, UPS? And if so, like you really don't have much wiggle room in negotiating rates there yet until you're fully established. So smaller brands are going to run into some of these issues, and they don't have the flexibility to go ahead and like do these today. But if you know your core demographics, like New York City, where I am, you can do set up like same day fulfillment services. Of course, you pay more to get that product out there, but hopefully you built that into your margins, or you take a loss on your first one and bring them back on a recurring system. But yeah, you have to adapt. Customers always come first. They're going to dictate what you want to do. But you just need to be transparent. Like if your customers, it says 90% track the status online. Well, be realistic with how long it actually takes to deliver the goods. Like if you tell them it takes 5 to 7 business days, measure that, and hopefully it comes through to that. The other highlight here, away from the fulfillment side, is innovative. Like, how do you bring new and relevant products to the market? Well, that's actually harder depending on what you're doing. If you're doing a personal care brand and you're constantly changing formulas, well, you have to go through the rigor and the testing of doing such, and not constantly do the changeover if you're doing it correctly. But you should also be listening to your consumers and building your pipeline of products, hopefully around your consumer's voice, if it fits with what you're doing. But that takes time. But if you're transparent and sharing that information and like, hey, this is a customer-driven product, I think they do appreciate that. But everything screams cost here, and early stage companies, it's probably not the best business model for them initially.
I think you touched on that point, raising it, you're in New York City, because I mean, if your customers are in more remote areas, Amazon definitely sort of overpromised that next day delivery to them, and they've actually scaled back. I know people farther away from like the supply chain who are just, they don't have that expectation anymore because it's not realistic. So if your customers are not in the cities, it's probably harder.
Yeah, the other thing is, and especially when you're a new brand, there's a lot of other things that are going to be pretty high cost that you're going to have to consider to do. And so as you're weighing that, is that the big differentiator that's going to allow you to beat your competition? We see brands drop a lot of money on PR and design firms. And like, ultimately that's a decision they have to weigh versus, do they want to tool something up that's new to build what they want to build, or are they going to use it on marketing? Or, you rarely see someone say, okay, I'm going to win at the last mile. So
yeah, I think it's very dependent on like what you're buying. Like I've been on Amazon where, I mean, I'm a Prime member, but if I can get something the next day as opposed to 3 days, and it's just like a generic like household item that I don't really care who makes it, I lean towards the expedited option. But I think it's very different for a lot of these D2C companies that maybe aren't, Amazon's not their first like retail channel that they're selling on. Because if there's a product that I really want, like it's a pair of like shoes, and I try them on, like I'm fine waiting a week because that's a tailored fit to your shoe, as opposed to like a toothbrush holder. Like I don't really care the brand of a toothbrush holder as much.
All right, we'll end there on toothbrush holders. That's all we have time for today. So I want to thank you, Dan. I want to thank you, Will, for sharing your expertise with us yet again. And thank you to everyone watching. If you enjoyed this, please be on the lookout for the next episode and tell all your friends about Just in Time by Anvyl. And to learn more about Anvyl, visit anvyl.com. Thanks a lot. Take care, everybody.